This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I'm in Chicago again today, and my guest on the podcast this week is John Laffler, co-founder of Off Color Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Oh, thank you.
We're sitting here in the Mousetrap Brewery down in just out of downtown Chicago, surrounded by steel in this room and some beautiful wood fooders from Italy in the room next door. We're going to talk about all sorts of fun and funky mixed culture fermentation and the like, as well as their foray into brewing sake. But first, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. Thinking outside the box, whether it's a simple relocation of the utility connections for a complex buildup or ground-level design and engineering, G&D is ready to meet the challenge. Contact G&D Chillers today at 1-800-555-0973 or reach out online at gdchillers.com. Mention this podcast and receive up to $1,000 worth of glycol with the purchase of any new G&D chiller. Also, turn your fridge into the best craft beer around with the Tavour app. Get access to hard-to-find, 100% independent craft beer from 47 states. Only buy the beers you want and skip the ones you don't. Ship any amount of your hand-picked beer to your doorstep for one flat fee. Yes, any amount. Download the free Tavour app today and get $10 in beer money with code BREWING. That's Tavour, T-A-V-O-U-R. Again, welcome to the podcast, John.
Thank you.
Let's for those that aren't familiar with Off Color and where you are right now, tell me a little bit about your foray in brewing, how you've kind of moved through that world of brewing, and what those steps are that kind of led you today to be brewing this kind of beer here at Off Color.
Sure. So I got my start professionally, more or less, when Dave Blightner, my business partner, we both met at Siebel. We graduated here in Chicago in 2008, I think. So we met at beer school. Before that, we both sort of had different careers, wanted to do something different, which is not an uncommon story. So went to Siebel, went through that. I started working at, right after that, we both started interning at Metropolitan, which is a local lager brewery here, which is very near and dear to both of our hearts. Right when they were opening, so we got to see, from the very nascent stages,
right.
The sort of first couple of weeks of a craft brewery opening up. This was 10 years ago, longer than that. It was about a decade ago when there was, Half Acre and this is pre-revolution.
Right.
There was 2 new breweries in Chicago for the first time in 15 years, something like that. So the barrier to entry was much, much higher. And the amount of knowledge base out there of how to actually do anything was much lower.
Sure.
So we both helped out there. I was also working part-time mostly part-time at a very fancy liquor store we had here called West Lakeview Liquors. Unfortunately, RIP West Lakeview Liquors, but that is a recent development. West Lakeview was super important to us in Chicago craft beer. It was sort of our main place where you go and find beers that you've never seen anywhere else.
Sure.
They're very much into imports. You go there, you find strange craft beers from Iceland. Some of the Nugno stuff you never find anywhere else in Chicago, at least not curated. You might be able to go to like a Benny's or a Sam's when it was still Sam's, and they might have some of it, but not curated, and it would be extremely old. And anyways, West Lakeview was very important to a lot of us because it was sort of that really deep dive into what beer was, because there wasn't this American craft beer scene the way that it is now, and not nearly with the depth. And that's where I really started developing there was love for it before, but really went very deep into my love of very esoteric, what I think of as very elegant, sophisticated taste profiles.
Yeah.
Never been extremely into double IPAs and things where the main focus is flavor intensity. I always like flavors to be more harmonious and sort of beer to be telling a story as you're drinking it.
Yeah.
It should tell a sense of who the person is making it, what they're trying to express, and sort of should be a little something more than just a commodity that we consume.
Yeah.
That's how I personally look at beer, and that talks a lot about our ethos here at Off Color. After that, 'cause I'm a little into the weeds, which I am prone to do.
We'll get back to that later on, I promise.
After that, Dave went to go work at Two Brothers, which is a brewery we have here out in the suburbs. And I went to go scrub floors at Goose Island.
Scrub floors?
Yeah. No, I got hired as sanitation crew.
Okay.
I was on my business cards when I started. When I left, I still had the same box business cards. They liked how well I scrubbed floors, that they let me do some other fun stuff. Got to mess around a lot with the barrel program, and did a fair amount with that, along with my supervisor then was Tom Quarter, who's now over at Penrose. So it was a very fun time to be in beer. Goose Island was always very, very good to me. I was there through the buyout, which is often a question that I get. I was not pleased about that. When it happened, we were told we were allowed to express some concern, and my statement that day was that I have some concern. But Greg and John Hull, gave me a shot here. They were always extremely influential. My day would sort of start when I worked at Goose. I would sort of walk into work, go find some coffee. Find where I left my coffee cup the day before. Go find some coffee. Especially people who worked with me there will know all those stories. And then go sit down in Greg's office and just chat with him and with Chelsea, his sort of personal assistant, good friend of mine. We just talk about beer, and I'd sort of bring him some of the stuff they were working on in the R&D side, sort of get his feedback on what those were, why we were doing it, and why we were doing stuff was often a large part of that conversation, which is, you can see how important that is to me still.
Yeah.
But the whole time, Dave and I had always had the idea of eventually we'll start our own brewery, but we thought it was very important to learn how a brewery runs.
Go figure.
That seems like it should be a part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
Not just my mom likes my beer, the neighbors at the barbecue think it's really good.
Yeah.
That's all well and good. That's great. You should have great beer. But this is a factory that we work in. If you want to equate it to the restaurant world, you sort of start washing dishes, and then you learn how to work the salad bar, and then you work your way up, learning each station along the way, so you understand how the entirety works. All the ins and outs and the nuances. When you come in just at the top level, you don't necessarily have all those intermediary skill sets that you learn.
Yeah.
Sort of even still every year I try to learn a new aspect of this trade. So I know a lot more about plumbing and electrical work than you ever thought.
Sure.
About solenoid valve design. When the bottling line goes down, it's not like there's people you can call that can just rush in and fix it. You figure it the fuck out.
Mark from Iron Hill was on a podcast episode a few weeks ago, and he mentioned how they like to hire for the brew house from if people want to come work for him, and they have a lot of people reach out to him, that he sends them to the restaurant side and says go get a job serving, cleaning, something in the restaurant, and if you're good, then we may hire you from there. And to see if people are working and have that kind of ethic, and but also understanding the business and understanding the pressure, and of course, as most of the time you spend in a brew house is spent cleaning, more so than actually brewing. But you're right. So you put yourself through that kind of professional on the job learning program coming out of Siebel, working in these professional environments. What led and you have that dream to launch your own brewery. What told you that was the right time to do it, and how did you develop a focus for this business at Off Color?
For Dave and I, it was time. We'd kind of learned all the things we needed to learn. I accomplished most of the things I wanted to at Goose, and it was sort of time for me to move on, regardless of where I was going to go after that. There's a lot of changes that were happening in that program at that time. It was really time to move on. And then the sort of the climate in Chicago was right. We were kind of at the tail end of that sort of big wave of new breweries opening up. And we had Solemn Oath and Penrose and us, and a whole host of other breweries opening up around that time. So we were sort of hitting that end of the second wave. It was time to do it. And we also had gotten financing.
Oh, well, that's convenient.
So that helps. Yeah.
Sure.
Opening a brewery is not particularly cheap. It's gotten a lot cheaper,
and certainly not in a metropolitan area like Chicago, where you're also dealing with a lot of regulations, unions, the whole nine yards for city regulators, and some at times capricious laws about what you do.
Oh no, the city officials are all our friends.
Are they? Good.
Yeah, they're wonderful. I cannot say enough nice things.
Yeah,
about dealing
we
with
love
the
city regulators. So then you convince a bank, or I assume it's a bank, or to.
Yeah, we have debt financing as well as investorship.
Okay. How do you make a case for brewing now the styles of beer that you've decided to focus on? Because you, as you mentioned earlier, have a love and a passion for more esoteric beers and more harmonious beers. Beers that may not be as intense and flavor forward as as maybe the current trend. Coming out with an approach like that through a brewery like this may seem to be a little riskier than some others.
It certainly is, but at the same time, we are a very niche brewery. It's very much part of our DNA, and there's some pros and cons to that. On the upside, not a lot of other breweries are making types of beers we make, so we stand out in that regard. For us, it's very important. Big part of it is just if we're just going to come out and make the same beer as everybody else, what's the whole fucking point of this?
Yeah,
I can make more money working somewhere else and work a lot less. If we're just going to make the same pale ale as a brewery down the street, and now there are literally breweries down the street. I don't get a point of putting yourself through all this if you're not doing it for a reason. And for us, it was to make the beers that we think should be made. If you are very into pale ale, that's great. You all do you. For us, that wasn't it. For us, it was trying to make things that were a little harder to make that other people weren't. Puts us in our own little camp, which is nice.
Sure.
We're also, Dave and I individually are both very cagey people.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily play along well with others all the time.
Yeah.
Very, very, craft beer had this whole ethos of very rugged individualists. I feel like we've lost a little bit of that, but it's also just dilution. And it's also great because that's not necessarily the best thing in the world. Is the 1995 craft brewery model where you had a bearded, grunty, angry guy in the back that's not allowed to talk to the customers.
Right. I guess I could see this as multiple and different reasons for getting into the brewing business. There's that I want to provide hospitality and experience, of this place and this beer and make people happy. There's that, I want to build a successful business that I can then, flip and retire on. Don't love that idea, but and then there's this idea that you seem to come at it with, where we have a creative vision for creating these kinds of beautiful but underappreciated styles of beer, and pushing a gospel with that kind of creative vision for what we're making in this very particular and kind of niche approach, and it would seem like yours is probably the most risky of those, but at the same time most personally creatively fulfilling.
Never said we were smart. But to mitigate that risk, from the very beginning, we started. You can either sell all your beer in one place, which very much ties you to the types of beers that people in that place want to buy, at least in the volumes that you need to sustain the business, or you can go wider. So we started working with 12% imports, which is similar to Shelton Brothers and what they do.
Right.
So they have a very small amount of breweries that make very interesting beers for the most part, and they sell them very far afield. So
it's this wide but very shallow kind of distribution approach where you're generally working through 12%, putting your beers primarily in urban environments where there's a savvy consumer that may be looking for something out of the norm, targeting those beer bars that get it, that are looking for those more unique products and those unique beers that tell some different kind of story or echo a certain kind of place. And by going wide, now that there's certainly more costs and less margin involved when you start moving in a business like that. Obviously, all the beer that you sell over the counter at your own tap room is going to be the most profitable beer for you to sell. How do you work through that to kind of create this idea of the brand within these kind of disparate communities, and locales? Normal breweries hire reps in a market and they go out and they tell the story, and retailers and consumers come to and experience that story in some way with reps, and they get it out there. It becomes harder then for something like Off Color to tell a story like that in this wide and kind of shallow environment.
Oh, 100%. Fortunately, social media came and changed how we're able to talk to people.
Yeah.
So we have found the guy who ran the best cat Twitter account on the internet, and then we hired him. Social media has certainly changed our ability to directly discuss our beers and why we're doing them to consumers who are interested and to retailers whom are interested. We do a lot with emailing retailers directly of, these are beers we're working on. All of them sort of need some explanation of why we're doing it and what they are. Otherwise, if you're not supporting your beer, it's not going to move. And if you don't care about your beer, why is anybody else going to care about your beer? But it certainly has a challenge. Fortunately, the traditional model for regionals was you had to add a person in each market. Otherwise, there's no point in sending beer to the market. But that's an extremely expensive way of doing it. And then, the farther afield you are, the less pull-through you have. But, by being able to just get on the internet and talk to people more or less directly to help mitigate a lot of that risk.
Yeah.
We still got to maintain the sort of the intellectual and creative freedom we got by not having to, sell enough beer locally to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
We can find our people around the country.
And now you do. We're sitting here at the Mousetrap, which has a large tap room attached to it, or a relatively large tap room attached to, to the kind of wild and funky brewery here. And so it seems like you are now playing both of those, sides and have found a large enough audience here that can continue to kind of patronize this, tap room environment.
Yeah, I mean, both markets are very important to us. Our sort of local people that come here, every week and sort of follow us along and see what we're doing, as well as people who come from out of town, which is why we're here in Lincoln Park, which is not the, people were very surprised we moved here as opposed to going into Logan Square or somewhere that every other brewery is going into.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily zig when people zag, but we kind of look for where the opportunities are. And so much of our market share and so much of our the people that really support us are from far afield. So people coming in from out of town, Chicago is a great town to come into. So we're close to downtown because you can just jump up here on the Red Line. You can take a lift from downtown for $10.
Yeah, mine was $7.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and 15 minutes, right, or 12 minutes, piece cake.
Yeah, we could have spent a quarter of the amount we spent on rent. But if you have to spend 45 minutes going to a part of Chicago that kind of looks a little sketchy and you're not from here, that's not necessarily the most welcoming to people from out of town. Again, we sell beer nationally, and a lot of our audience is that national market.
Yeah. So let's start talking about some of these beers you make. We're drinking a rice lager, and I'd love to. We've got a table full of some very creative expressions of beer. Before we go to that direction, balancing barley and hops is your expertise, and for Clarion Lubricants, food-grade lubricants is theirs. The team at Clarion knows that when it comes to making great beer, you are the expert, and when it comes to supplying food-grade lubricants backed by service-oriented professionals, they're the experts. Clarion will work with you to create an efficient lubrication program that helps protect your brewery. To speak with an expert, dial 1-855-MY-CLARION. That's 855-692-5274, or visit clarionlubricants.com. Clarion Lubricants, the expert that experts trust.
Ska Fabricating is excited to announce the new and improved half-pint OD mobile depalletizer. The OD is made up of stainless steel and lightweight aluminum with a new patent-pending rotary table design that provides accumulation and natural back pressure to help cans flow smoothly and consistently into your filler. This machine can run up to 80 cans per minute, features over 180 degrees of flexibility for rinse cage placement, and even has a smaller footprint than the original half-pint. It's a breakthrough design for breweries in search of a fully automated solution that fits a tight space and budget. To learn more, contact Ska Fab today at 970-403-8562 or reach out online at skafabricating.com.
So tell me a little bit about some of these beers that we're going to drink. Like I said, I wanted to talk about your foray into sake. But I think some of the beers that you're most known for, that tend to travel around the country, the most are beers like Apex Predator and Troublesome Gose. And tell me a little bit about some of those kind of core focuses for you, and then how that extends out to some of the more limited expressions.
Sure. So much of our beer and sort of what we try to do is make beers a little experimental, which push people a little bit, which is still approachable and drinkable. For the most part, we're a very fermentation-focused brewery, especially here at Mousetrap as opposed to production. We have a little bit of split in how we do things and where we do things now, since we have two facilities and we can have a nice sharp divide of where wild stuff lives and where clean beers live.
And you have 2 separate brew houses in each of those locations in order to keep it completely separate?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a truck that goes back and forth, and that's really about the only... we try not to share equipment when we can possibly help it. You can get away with doing wild stuff, mixed ferm stuff, and sacro-only beers in a brewery for a while with good cleaning practices and good SOPs, and we got away with it for a while. It had been a while. Cool, how long are we going to push this for before something catastrophic goes wrong? But that being said, we still have...
And you made the split before anything catastrophic went wrong?
Yeah, fortunately. But we still have, very wild lacto tanks over there. We still do a lot of Blender Weiss over there.
Right.
So we're not, completely... And there's still some wild wood stock over there in smaller barrels. So we don't have the complete separate divide, but we're not flipping tanks and, going from a Brett beer in one and then doing sack right afterwards. Again, you can do that with good practice, but at one point your luck's going to run out.
Sure.
So we were fortunate enough to be able to split before we had something horribly wrong go wrong. Not like we've never dumped a tank before, because that's part and parcel of this whole thing. Again, my sort of personal feeling is if you're not taking enough risks in terms of what you're trying to do and trying to accomplish, that you are dumping beer here and there, you're not trying hard enough. You're just playing it too safe. No idea what your original question was.
No, I mean, but that isn't actually. I like that point that you're making. That you should be pushing some limits there. Mm-hmm. And if you're not, kind of finding the edge, then then you're not really striving hard enough.
Yeah, I mean, and some brewers, to be honest, some brewers really love being a shift brewer, coming in and just nailing their specs every time, and trying to eke out another 0.5% efficiency on your mash. And you know what? That's a very valuable skill set. And if you can cut out, $50 a turn, that adds up real quick. So that's a very valuable part of brewing. And one of the things I like about this industry is it's wide enough and deep enough that everyone can find something in it that really appeals to them.
Yeah.
So sort of our flagship beer, by definition, is of course Apex Predator. Apex, which is 70% or 80% of our production.
Okay.
So it's by far in a way it's our Allagash White, which is also a delicious beer, by the way. Never missed a chance to plug that.
Of course. An Apex Predator is a farmhouse ale saison.
Yep. It's a dry hop. It's by far our hoppiest beer, and we're the first people to say we don't make particularly hoppy beer, and then our largest beer is of course our hoppiest one.
Yeah.
The whole point of that beer from concept was to demonstrate the importance of fermentation. The yeast in it is so expressive that even though it's a relatively, in today's terms, it's mildly dry hopped, but it's still a moderately dry hopped beer, that the fermentation profile is still dominant. What was kind of neat about that beer that works well for us is it ages more or less gracefully, as opposed to a IPA or a very hop-centric beer. As those hops fade, which is inevitable, we do our best, and a lot of our brewer tricks are trying to extend flavor, how long flavors last and are appropriate. But if you have a hop-centric beer and those hops die away, then you have nothing left.
Right.
Whereas with Apex, because it's a fermentation-focused beer, it just sort of changes, kind of like how Orval changes over time. Right. I personally like Apex around 3 or 4 months when that hop character has started to dissipate, and sort of the weirdo funk comes out. That's a pure sack beer. Yeah. So there's no mixed culture or anything in there. But the yeast itself is kind of weirdo. It throws all this slightly tangerine, but really juicy fruit bubble gum. We do a couple tricks. We ferment it super hot. And then we add some sucrose, which is also, for us, is an important part of getting the fermentation profile we're looking for out of that beer. We're just trying.
What does the sucrose then do?
It bumps up ester profile.
Okay.
It's not a ton, but it's enough. It's like feeding bread to ducks. It gets them all excited real quick.
Okay.
It's a little bit like fast food.
Yeah.
So it gets the yeast a little hyper to start off with. It helps us bump our initial fermentation. Gets
that doesn't cause any attenuation issues. It's not like they get so excited about this crack that you've just fed them, and then now they've got to go do the hard work and they get bored with it.
It's not enough to have catabolic repression. No, okay. It's not that high. Though we do a triple, which is 18% sucrose. That's when I really start to worry about catabolic repression.
Okay.
If you add too much sucrose, and obviously the yeast will learn to just eat the sucrose and be like,
Right.
oh, I don't want to eat this carbohydrate. Are you kidding me? It's two fucking sugars put together? Fuck you. But no matter that we add, it's, 100 pounds of sucrose, I think, off the top of my head. It's been a while since that's one of those beers, like, you just, in your seat, you used to be able to make it, but I haven't made it in a while. But it's enough to dry the beer out a little bit. It ends at, 1.8 Plato. So we're going for very dry on that.
Sure.
So it helps with that.
How'd you go about selecting a yeast for that one?
That was always when that yeast comes from one of the little breweries in Belgium that I think is very interesting. And it's also not the most common one that everybody uses.
Okay.
But that was the yeast I started using when I was home brewing. Always super loved it.
Yeah.
And it works relatively well. There's some tricks to it. It's not as finicky as like the Phantom stuff is.
Okay.
Or like the quintessential, like what people think of as DuPont. You can buy from Y yeast is super finicky. So we don't use that. But just very much like that yeast, not a lot of people were using it. It's just like, this yeast spits out a ton of juicy fruit and bubble gum. That's what we're trying to look for in this beer. And we mash that with some crystal and some sterling, and I think it works very well. And people seem to like it. But we were able to expand on that. Those are our core beers, and we have Troublesome. We started making Gose when I think it was just like us and Westbrook were the only people making Gose in the U.S.
Right.
Or like maybe like some brew pubs like Denver would do it as a one-off for a season or something. But this was way before the Gose had its sort of moment in the sun, and everyone fucked it all up. But I have strong opinions on that.
Let's get back to that one in a second. I want to hear. In fact, why don't you tell me about that? When you say other brewers have fucked it up, what do you mean by that?
So we had the tendency as Americans to just always try to turn volume up more, and we think we're so fucking clever because we can just it's just louder.
Yeah,
it's louder.
yeah.
It's like it's not better. It's just louder. I don't think that is a big it is our hallmark of innovation, but I don't think it's a particularly elegant form of innovation.
And we do it across everything. I mean, music is a perfect example of that. If you look at the way that music is produced these days, it's compressed to shit so that the dynamic range is incredibly tight, and that allows them to increase the overall volume of it. And again, just to make it louder, so that one song comes out louder on the radio than the next, or on Spotify or however the fuck people listen to it. But that same principle kind of applies as that volume gets louder, and you lose that dynamic range, and you lose that the highs and the lows, and they just get sacrificed at this altar of volume. That seems to have an interesting corollary to what you're talking about here.
100%, yeah. So trouble from us is.
So how are brewers then turning the volume up on Gose in a way that's ruining it?
So we make ours much more like the Gose was. It has a very slightly brackish water source from the Gose River. We add a fuck ton of salt to it because it has salt on label. So ours is saltier than the next guy's. German Gose is more delicate. It had more expression. You get malt character, you get slight salinity, which adds to the mouthfeel as opposed to just being salty for salty's sake. We're not trying to over savory a beer. We're just trying to highlight some of the richer mouthfeel. I mean, fucking old guys at bars in the 70s would do that. They take their bottle along next to Budweiser and sprinkle a little salt on it. Not like I think they knew exactly why, but they just knew that their beer tastes fuller when you do that. So these are sort of some of the things we're looking for. We're looking for expression of the entirety of the beer, as opposed to just central characteristics. But American Gose very quickly became way over salted, became way too acidic for what I think the beer should be. Fortunately, we all get to have our own breweries, and it's not that hard to have a brewery anymore. So if you disagree with me, open your own fucking place. But this is why we think Gose should taste. This is how we want Gose to taste. This is how we make Gose. Then everyone started adding tons of fruits to it and all that shit. And we do a couple Gose variants. I think we have our hibiscus one on right now at the bar. So it's not like we're purists in this regard.
Yeah.
But I just think all these flavors should be harmonious and in concert with each other, not just let's take two aspects of the beer and just blow them up, and then we can auto-tune the rest. Like that's not.
So, but brewing a beer like that strives towards a very delicate balance and that kind of dynamism can be incredibly difficult. much more difficult than doing something like putting more salt in it or more fruit in it. Building some malt character and expression of that balances with a very light, salinity, and a very gentle acidity. I mean, pulling those things into balance, with those subtle flavors becomes an even bigger challenge. How do you create character even within that that beer that's balanced at this very, very light level?
Well, that's why it's called troublesome.
Yeah.
That beer probably took us 32 iterations before we kind of got it right. We took that beer apart, put it back together a couple different ways.
Yeah.
At first, we started trying to do all the fermentation all at once. So we do a lactobacillus fermentation, and then we also do a sac fermentation.
Right.
We're trying to do those in a core morbid process, and that was just too variable. So some turn out great, others not turn out as great. And I would always rather have less 100% beers and more like, if your average is you have a couple 100% beers and you have a couple 70 beers on how true to style range this is. You'd rather sacrifice the really highs and have a more consistent product. That's sort of our hallmark as professionals.
Yeah.
And then try to raise up the sort of that mean. So rather not have those highlights. I'm saying the same thing in 3 different ways.
I see what you're saying. The average of your hundreds with your 70s gives you an 85, but if you can give away some hundreds and get that average up to, mid 90s, then overall you're doing much better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we had to split those 2 fermentations. We now we have a dedicated lacto tanks that have, some wild lactobacillus in them. We use a Solera process on that too. So we sort of add a little bit of beer to it. It acidifies. We pull some of that out. We pasteurize it, and then blend that into a fermenting beer.
Okay,
that
so it's not a single stream, kind of kettle sour process. It is pulling from a stock of acid beer or light acid beer in this case, and then blending to the exact spec for acidity.
And that worked much better for us to hit a consistent, repeatable product. So that was one of the learning processes we had of scaling this up from 5-gallon scale.
Sure. How about malt? Building a malt and beer character to this kind of thing that's got these other strong flavors in it, but also at the same time a body that needs to remain incredibly light, despite that kind of flavorful malt character. How do you what tricks do you use to kind of build more character despite that kind of light body?
Well, we use best malt because it has best right on it, so then it's...
It says best right on the label.
I mean, they would get sued otherwise. We actually have switched malts from them now too, but I still use you can see I still use a fair amount of best malt.
You use second best malt now?
Yeah, it's cheaper.
Yeah. Okay.
Fast Eddie's discount malt. It's fine is their tagline. Blending malt is like anything else. It's sort of coming up through beer in the 90s and seeing all that. Everyone just added Crystal 60 to everything and just over-sweetened everything. So we tend to we use a lot of Pils malt as our base malts. We use pale in, 2 beers a year. We tend to go for dryness, so we want attenuation. So we're looking for lighter malts, and I use some really old school. I use a lot of special aromatic. I think it's me and 3 Floors are the only people in Chicago that use it, and I get whatever they don't buy, I can maybe get. So I have to sub for Vienna a lot. Personally, as just me, not as everybody else in our company, the beers I design tend to use the same 4 or 5 malts, and just in different proportions. I kind of know what they do, and that's not... the malt character is important to our beers, but it's not the hallmark of our beers. Usually we're trying to just get a little groundwork and then have it get out of the way.
Yeah.
So we tend to not use stuff that leaves a lot of residual sugars, because all of our beers are as dry as for the most part, as dry as we can get them.
Yeah. So beyond something like troublesome, where do you go from there? And let's start to talk about how you've now built Mousetrap to focus on these mixed fermentation beers, wild cultures, foeder aged beers, and how you now think about moving into that additional heightened level of acidity and other flavor components to these beers.
Yep, and concept is the same as any of our other beers. We're just trying to have our harmonious and symphonic whole with disparate parts. We just have more parts to play with over here.
Yeah.
Sort of this I always love wild brewing. I think it's the most interesting part. It's like otherwise it's a very industrial process, which is cool enough in its own right, but I like how things change over time. I like using fruits that have seasonality to them or that are different from year to year. I do use some fruit juices and stuff, which is a commodified product. It's not like we're going to the farmer's market and just buying fruit there, because fresh fruit is fucking dumb for a lot of fruit beers. But that's
really,
oh yeah.
Why?
You get less flavor, color, and aroma extraction.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of IQF fruit, or individually quick frozen. By freezing the fruit, you burst the ice crystals form, they burst the cell walls.
Yeah.
And then you get better flavor, color extraction out of them. If you just go to the farmer's market and then you take whole fruit and you throw it in a beer, it takes forever, and you get, in my opinion, you get less flavor out of it. So the same as...
but it's a much more romantic story.
Oh, and the story is important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you the story is not important. But yes, it's much less romantic than like I went and bought this from Farmer Phil, and I asked how his goats were doing, and Cindy's a little bit lame, but she's gonna come along. It's a much better story. We still use local farmers. We buy a lot of stuff from Sealing. We buy a fair amount of stuff from Klug. There are fruit farms that a lot of Chicago brewers use. They're in Southwest Michigan for the most part. And we do the farmers market I used to go every week. I don't go every week anymore. But we are very involved in the agricultural aspect of it. Part of our Midwestern DNA is part of that as well. But I use a fair amount of fruits. I use a lot of Asian fruits, a lot of very esoteric fruits. Use a lot of like yuzu and calamansi and stuff in that sort of similar vein.
And you can find that individually quick frozen?
Oh, no. I have a couple importers that we've sort of worked and developed relationships with, to the point where they're like, oh, cool, like we're thinking about bringing this stuff into the U.S. You want to try it? I'm like, yes. Can I get through the FDA? And then so long as it's legal for us to use, and I want to try it. We did a blender vice with those little miracle berries once. That was super cool because they changed your perception of acid to sweet. So why don't we put them in acidic beer? The whole point of that was to put it into someone was doing like a blender vice festival or competition, some shit like that. So I was like, let's just ruin this for everybody. And it worked to some extent. We only did, I think I dicked around with that twice, but.
And so this berry changes. How long does that effect last?
About half an hour.
Okay. So for the next half an hour, it changes your palate, so you perceive acidity as sweetness.
Yeah.
Man, you really were screwing with everybody there. Huh?
Yeah. Well, again, if we're not trying new things and just trying to have fun with this, but I mean, that's not going to be a commercially successful beer.
Right.
But it's fun to experiment with and try out.
Sure. So puree. Obviously, if you're okay with quick frozen fruit, you can't have a philosophical problem with puree, huh?
Not necessarily. I have a little stick blender right there that we use. Those are great because you have to macerate the fruit at some point.
Right.
So my personal favorite is using IQF, and then we blend it down.
Okay. Do you blend it down, like pull some beer off of the tank to make your blend with that beer, or
when we let the fruit defrost, because those cell walls have been burst, it's much more juicy than if we would just freeze it, or I'm sorry, if you just had a hole and we tried to puree it. If people use like Oregon fruit, like I don't give a fuck. I don't buy stuff from them, but that doesn't mean I have any philosophical issue with that. But when we use like yuzu, I'm not getting whole yuzus in and then peeling them by hand. I'm buying puree, or I'm buying pressed juice. There are some things which are very important, and other things which are more storytelling. Kind of like sea salt in Gose. It does not make a fucking bit of difference what type of goddamn salt you use, but you put pink Himalayan sea salt on it, and then all of a sudden it's like, ooh, fancy. Salt is salt in the levels that we're using. We're not. If you want to use fancy finishing salt and that will make people like your beer better, great, go for it.
Right.
I'm not here to yuck your yum. It does make a goddamn bit of lick a difference. So.
You mean you don't brew with Malden salt flakes for the individual character that those have to add to it? No.
Exactly. No, we're more focused on the technical aspect. Whereas if you switch salt brands, you should then look at the amount of sodium in that brand, because that's your actual balance point.
Right.
You can't just replace it by volume because some salt is saltier than other salt.
Yeah.
So we're looking at the percent salinity. but that's just how we make beer.
Let's talk a little bit about corralling wild cultures, and then maybe we should open up another beer here while we do it. When it comes down to it, you've been doing it for a long time, even from Goose Island days. Talk to me about how you develop, and then select for the kinds of flavors that you're looking for with the wild cultures that you work with.
Sure, that's very much the heart of what we do over here at Mousetrap. Or I'll probably call it MT at some point. But
okay,
that's just sort of our initials. Wild cultures and mixed stuff has always been very interesting to me. It takes a while to build mixed cultures up. It's very rare that you get super lucky and everything just happens. The culture we use in a fair amount of stuff right now, because it's working really well for us, we originally harvested off of blueberry skins. So we call our wilding culture our blueberry culture. We use it in wildings. We use it in we have a wild wheat beer called Critters. We've used it in a couple other things over the years.
And you just swabbed and plated and kind of grew it up from there, or was that?
It's a more romantic process.
Yeah.
Our illustrator Nikki Jarecki and I were up visiting. Actually, I'd call it Virtue Farms. It was before it was Virtue Farms, but up at Virtue, there's a You Pick It farm. So we picked some blueberries and brought them back and threw them in some wort and started bubbling, and then sort of cultured the yeast out of that.
Okay.
That stuff just so happened to be super expressive, and that doesn't ferment for shit, but it's pretty expressive. So we were able to blend that with a little bit of Saccharomyces. It's often what we find is when we source yeast directly from nature, or from old barrel stock or whatever, or a relatively actual wild or native harvest. It's rare that brewers' yeast are brewers' yeast because they do what we want them to do in the environment that we want them to do it in. Wild yeast don't have that training. They're not housebroken yet. So oftentimes you can either brew with them time and time again and sort of breed what you want into it by adding selective pressure. So they mutate into what we want them to do, and we naturally select for those yeasts that survive and mutate into what we want them to do. Or we can try to mix together different yeasts to, we'll add Saccharomyces. We use like 550 a fair amount. We've used sort of house saison. We've used some other ale yeasts for mixed culture stuff that will ferment the beer very well, but either their ester profile or their phenolic profile will either be harmonious or just negligent, or not negligent. I'm blanking on the word I want, but they'll just get out of the way. And the blueberry stuff is super expressive. It has this overwhelming aroma of blueberry juice, which is weird because I have a hard time with my bar staff here, even, or non-professional brewers being like, "Oh, it tastes like blueberries because you got from blueberries." No, that's
there's no connection there, right?
I don't know why it did that, but nature's kind of cool.
And is that a real thing that people identify blindly, or is there some sort of psychological connection which creates more of a suggestion of that because you know the story?
Well, we put on a label that it's harvested from blueberry skins.
Okay.
So there's certainly some suggestion in there, but if you smell it blindly, I personally think it's very blueberry-y. Because
both of those things, they're both equally valid. I mean, that power of suggestion and what it plants to your mind is real. It's it's not fake. But how do you as you were building and then selecting this culture for some of the traits that you like, what does that process look like, and how do you kind of push that culture through its evolution?
A lot of it's selective pressure. This fermented well, and we liked how it tasted, so we're going to use it again. This time it did not work so well, so let's look at what we did. And either the yeast is going in a direction we don't want it to go, and we can try to save it, or we can just ditch it. And we've certainly ditched things that have not worked out well.
And is this culture, a single wild yeast, or is this, are there other entities in there as well, lacto, PDO, or other things?
This is whatever the fuck was growing on blueberry skins that got dropped into wort 6 years ago and has been repropped. So
clearly you've done a thorough genetic analysis of all of this.
We actually have sent that. Creature Comforts is doing I think they're trying to get a talk together for CBC this year. So they got a bunch of wild cultures from different breweries, ran them through DNA sequentiation.
Oh, okay.
So we actually have gotten that done. But again, I don't know what that is a sequence of per se, because
Okay.
there's not just one thing in there.
Right.
We have tried to bank that now, because right now it kind of, it was living in one keg.
Yeah.
Like that was like our master culture, and that makes me very nervous.
That
because
would be, that would keep you up at night.
yeah. Now it lives in a keg and a fooder. So we tried banking it, then ordered from that bank and fermented a beer with it, and it's like, it's close, but it's not it.
Yeah.
So we're trying to rebank it with a different technique. But the thing with mixed culture is not just one thing.
Right.
So
right.
when you bring it down to a single cell, more or less, you're trying to grow up into a fermentable culture. Things grow at different rates.
Right.
So all of a sudden, your very well balanced or hopefully well balanced mixed culture is no longer in balance. And
Yeah. Now, are you growing up, and each time you produce a new beer with this, are you say for example, pulling beer out and then adding more beer back into that tank, Solera style? Are you now able to even like completely empty a tank and load fresh beer in and have the culture simply just live in that wood and continue that fermentation? What does that fermentation process look like each time you want to make a new beer using that culture?
Sure. So we got our fooders in. So they were new to us. They came out of a winery, so they're not brand new fooders.
Right.
But they were new to us, and they were not inoculated with the mixed cultures. We have 5 more or less different mixed cultures, and we
Okay.
have 5 fooders. It's almost as if those things are balanced with each other. So each one.
So that is intentional.
Yeah. We kind of had more stuff, but that's where we're at now.
Yeah.
There's also stuff that's living in those kegs over there.
Okay.
But that's a different story. So we fermented beer in stainless, and then transferred it to the fooders with mixed culture for their first fill, and then for the second one, drained out 80% of the liquid in there, leaving the yeast cake behind, and then just put fresh wort on top. So kind of like a Solera process, but not
Right.
as much.
It's really just almost cone to cone, but leaving it in the same fooder.
Exactly. And that we did very intentionally to try to get more cells to permeate the wood and sort of get to the point where those fooders we can drain completely,
Sure.
even rinse them out if we need to, if something goes off. And then, lightly clean them if necessary, but still have enough of the mixed culture
Right,
living
right.
in the wood itself that will self-inoculate. So we're getting to the point with some of those fooders. We have one where we had a pretty bad leak in the bottom, so I had to fully drain it.
Yeah.
And I was very worried that we were going to lose the cultures living there. So hard to half-barrel the yeast off the very bottom, or yeast or dead protein. It's not the best way of harvesting, especially because they're not cylindrical tanks.
Right.
But sort of did our best. Rinsed it out, fixed the leak in the bottom. We have a 2.5-inch threaded TC fitting that goes into the bottom, and just the wood around there. It's probably 20-year-old wood.
Right.
And then it's been holding acidic liquid for a long time.
Sure.
So it gets kind of wonky. So
Right.
fix that, rinse the tank, then cast the yeast back in, and it went right back to how we were expecting it to
Okay.
taste, which is very. I slept much better that night than I had in nights previous. Let's put it that way. But now that a lot of them are very well seasoned, if we need to or want to, we can pull everything out. And at a certain point, you don't want to keep adding fresh wort onto beer.
Right, because then that sludge and mess at the bottom can, certainly go a whole nother bad direction for you.
Oh yeah. Also, it's like, oh cool. So this is a 58 hectoliter fooder, and we have 20 hectoliters of dead yeast in the bottom of it. It's not a great thing.
Right.
But
And so you don't temperature control those. You're letting them sit at your ambient room temperature.
yeah, they do have cooling fins installed in them.
Okay.
We have glycol run to that room. So if it would, for whatever reason, get super hot in there, or if
Yeah.
we did something with a lot of sucrose where I'm worried that it's going to get too hot, we do have the ability to cool them if we wanted.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we do free rise stuff on there. There's some romantic aspect to that. It's like, we pitch it cool and we let it naturally rise, and there's this sense of it's the sense of place and time, and
Right.
that makes the beer special. Also, I never hooked the glycol up.
So your free rise is more of an excuse for just to.
Laziness.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a good story though.
Yeah.
How do you, manipulate in other kinds of ways the expression of things like acidity within that culture? Are you using any other tools to kind of bring certain things up and tone other things down?
I personally select for cultures that don't get too acidic.
Okay.
And when things start to get too acid, I don't like a ton of acid in beer, which you can tell with the beers that I make.
Sure.
I tend to not gravitate towards those cultures, or I'll put less of them in. What has been super fun is working with other breweries. Like, I really like doing collab beers. We don't do a ton of them, but I really enjoy doing them, and I enjoy doing them with breweries that either do something similar to us but in a very disparate way, or do stuff that is very different from what we do.
Okay.
I don't personally really get the, like, we make coffee beer and you make coffee beer, so let's make a hoppy beer together. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That being said, I do a lot of mixed culture stuff, so we work with other mixed culture breweries, and you can say the exact same thing about that. But
at least you're honest.
Yeah. First person to say that a lot of this shit is hypocritical. You could say nuance, but hypocritical is just fine. We do a fair amount of beers with Corey King down at Side Project.
Yeah.
And he's one of my favorite people to brew with because his palate is much more acid intense.
Yeah.
So it pushes me, and mine is much less. And we get into little, not spats, but like we talk about the use of spelt. He uses a lot of spelt. I use a very little bit of spelt. I use a fair amount of sugar in my beer. He uses none. And he's like, well, the beer's going to get dry enough as is, so I'm going to go to zero. I'm like, yeah, but there's sugar in it, so it's drier. Things that don't necessarily make a lot of sense, but
sure.
It was sort of razzing each other for it. But it's fun working with him because he has just such a different blending palette that, I make my beer, he makes his beer, and we make beer together or blend beer together. We create something different than either of us would do otherwise.
Right.
So I do think there's a little bit more authenticity and intellectual honesty than you do mixed ferm beer, I do mixed ferm beer, so we made a mixed ferm beer together.
So you've at least found other mixed fermentation brewers that do things with a different viewpoint and mindset, so that it pushes both, that whatever you create is more of a in-between between those two things.
Yeah. So that's super fun because a lot of what we do is blending. We create beer, but we've been fortunate that the first couple of pulls from our fooders have been special enough that we release them as is unblended.
Right.
But over time, that is less and less likely to happen. And that's where the blending aspect comes in, which I think is a super interesting part of beer.
Yeah.
And sort of one of those not well-developed techniques that we have in the U.S. Certainly, there's a lot more people doing it, and we've gotten better at it. But it's sort of one of those more or less unexplored frontiers of blending, as opposed to batch process brewing.
So how does that work for you? What does that blending process look like for you? Are these foeder beers becoming single stream beers that you release as that thing, or are you looking at all of these 5 foeders with different cultures in it, and then as some sort of base ingredients that work into blends for different kinds of beers?
So sort of the general concept of what we're doing here is taking foeder beer as a large batch process, more or less. Batch is not really the right word, but a large volume of beer.
Yeah.
Then we have a fair amount of puncheons, which are 5 hectoliter puncheons. We do everything in metric because that way no one can steal our secrets unless you live in any other part of the world besides here. Or Uruguay, I think, is the only other country, but whatever. We have a large volume of beer, and then we use...
It sounds smarter when you use metric, too. If you just sound more European, it's more classic and romantic.
Man, so fucking classy over here. Yeah. But with the puncheons, we were able to create it will take more risks, because if a puncheon goes off or it doesn't work out, we can just ditch it, and we're out $600, as opposed to a foeder, which is much more expensive and harder to even physically get in and get out of the building if we had to get rid of it, which I don't want to do. People ask how long the puncheons last for, and I say, how long the foeders last for. I'm like, well, we have a 10-year lease, so hopefully 10 years. They're pretty much built into the building at this point.
Yeah.
Getting them out would be a nightmare. But with puncheons, it can take a lot more risks, because if it goes off, it goes off. So we create much more flavor-intense beers in those, with the idea that we can then take the foeder stuff as if we're not doing single pulls out of them, and then use the more intensely flavored puncheons in order to push that beer around. 'Cause it's about 10% of the volume. Obviously, we can use more or less, but one puncheon is about 10% of the volume of what we'd pull from a foeder.
Yeah.
So if we want it to have more raspberry character, we can add a fuck ton of raspberries to a puncheon, and then push that over if you wanted.
And then would you ultimately blend a certain portion of foeder beer in with that puncheon raspberry beer in order to kind of dial into what this vision for what that final beer tastes like?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So then these are all generally a kind of blending process.
That's the general concept.
Yeah.
We're on second pull or third pull on a lot of our foeders, so we've been fortunate, especially in the first pulls, we wanted to have them be just that foeder more or less.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to pull that vinous character, the spirit character out of the seasoned foeder. But as we've pulled all that wine character out, the beers get a little bit more neutral because there's not that other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
So that's where the other blending comes back in.
And now you're also using some smaller barrels that still have that kind of fresh vinous character to it and then pulling some beer out of foeders and putting it into some of those barrels to push some of that wine character back into it?
Yeah, exactly. And it will also we'll do that. Another nice thing about puncheons is you can get rid of them.
Yeah.
You can always have fresh wine puncheons come in to get that vinous character back.
Yeah.
But then we're also seasoning those puncheons with the microbes that are living in the foeder beer. So we're doing two things at once. We're getting the fresh vinous character we want out of the puncheons, and we're also seasoning it for volume expansion.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting process. And then so when you're looking at this stock that you have, how does that process of envisioning a beer that you want to make from them, how does that proceed through it? Where's that inspiration come from where you say or are you throwing samples and tasting each one of them and then blending in beakers and trying to find some mix that works, or do you take a more kind of vision approach and have this idea that pops into your head in the shower and say, I bet I could do this with these things, and let me go try that? What's that creative process look like?
Well, we start with the top-down high concept, and then you end up with the beaker shit.
Okay.
This is what we wanted to do, and this is what we got, and which is kind of neat because you can start from a top-down process, and that works most of the time, 80% of the time. But best laid plans of my cement, of course.
Right.
But then the also super fun part is the other end, where you're starting with all these disparate beers in multiple barrels with very different threads, and then creating a cohesive beer out of those beers.
Yeah.
Both are interesting and fun processes. I had a blast. I was over at not a humble brag, because I was humbled to be there, over at Jolly Pumpkin 4 or 5 months ago. Ron Jeffries is one of the people I really look up to.
Sure.
I still remember the first BAM beer I had. That was one of those quintessential there's more to beer than I know that there is, and this is really neat, and I want to know more about it.
Right.
That was my experience with BAM beer. So getting to know him over the years has been great. I just happened to be there I was passing through town going somewhere. I don't quite remember why I was there. Be like, we're just gonna do some blending if you want to come and sit down. I'm like, yes, please.
Sure.
Yeah, I promise to be really quiet and not voicing anything. I don't know. But it was a super fun experience for me to get to sit down with Ron Jeffries and sort of go through the process and see how they do it, which is fortunately not very disparate or different than how we do it.
Yeah.
But
the same process. I mean, Ron's always learning too, and I know he's taken some field trips out to blend with other prominent blenders. Same kind of thing. Not he has his process and it's great, but he always wants to learn from other people too. And so no one thinks they've got it all figured out at this point. Everyone's open to that kind of creative inspiration from other visionaries. Mm-hmm. Let's switch gears a little bit. I mentioned earlier that you've kind of found yourself making a foray into sake and brewing sake, which is kind of some new territory for American craft brewers and kind of a growing segment, if yet still a small one. Where was the inspiration that came behind that? And talk to me a little bit about how what you've learned through that process.
We started. Here's some if you want to try it.
Sure.
So we started doing sake as we were making a beer with the Field Museum, which is our big natural history museum here.
Yeah.
We do some recreations of historic beverages periodically with them. And we were working with one of their archaeologists on doing a beer we did called Kingming, which was a recreation of a beverage that they sort of figure out how they did through analysis and through some codification. That was the first time they written down how they did mold-based sacrification in Asia in 1300 BCE, something like that. It's been a while since I've had to do these talking points. But it's interesting for us because, in the West, we have, we sacrifice carbohydrate with the malting process. And then we get the enzymes are created during the malting process. We then harvest those enzymes through mashing, right. As opposed to how they're doing things in Asia with mold-based saccharification. So they grow up this mold, which releases exogenous saccharification enzyme, and then you add that. Which is a much different process, and it's kind of cool just to learn something new and do something different. Every couple of years, it's just nice to learn something else that's not just stock brewing. Sure. So started just messing around with it for making that beer, kind of learn the process, and then went, we're opening up this new place. Got a little bit of time on our hands because our fermentations here are very long fermentations, so there are days where I don't have much to do.
Right.
I guess I could scrub the floors a little bit more, but that's it's also nice to I'm here, might as well be doing something interesting.
Sure.
So we started developing the sake process, went through all the licensure steps and all that. And there's not a lot of resource out there. There's a little bit of resource, but not a ton of resource in the U.S. of how to do this. So it's sort of unexplored territory. And it allows us to approach fermentation in a different way. Because then I look at a lot of beer through the fermentation aspect. So we're taking sake yeast, we're blending it with some of our mixed culture stuff. Because I think it would be kind of inappropriate for us to just jump in right off the gate and trying to make Daijingo and just high-end competition sakes. I don't have the background in it. I don't know anything about it. The first person to tell you I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. So we want to have our own take on this. Is we're approaching rice-based fermentations through the lens of what we do as Off Color.
So our own take is a clever way of saying we have an out if it doesn't taste as good as some of the well-made Japanese stuff.
Or extremely different. So we make particularly rustic sake because that's just kind of what our ethos is not trying to make extremely refined.
Rustic beer too.
Exactly. So it's very much a work in progress. Sort of every time that we make a batch, we sort of all the money we make for we put back into the program to try to buy more equipment. We're getting to the point where got everything we kind of need and the scale that we need it in. I got a little bladder press so I can press it more efficiently. That's been a godsend. So it took a process which took about 8 hours by hand. Now I can do it in 45 minutes to an hour. And get a lot better efficiency. So for that, the rice, the water, the yeast, and the koji are all mixed together in a tank and all ferment at the same time. So it's a comorbid process, which is also kind of cool because that's not how we do things in brewing, where we have different batch processes. At the end of it, we have this sort of liquid slurry, like this oatmeal-y porridge sort of deal. So we press that to separate the liquids and the solids, and then we take those rice solids, the lees, and then we add them to the mash tun for Pilsen beer, and that's how we make koi, which is our sake pills. So that's the beer we had at first. We take the more liquid portion. I'm sure you saw me pour some of that off earlier.
Right.
So after we separate it, it's not a fine filtration, so there's still those very fine particulate solids in there. Those are heavier, so they'll fall to the bottom of whatever vessel you put them in. We then rack the clearer sake off the top, leaving the heavier weight stuff on the bottom, and then we add that liquidy portion in Whirlpool, which it's not a ton, but it adds a ton of flavor, which is probably the most surprising thing to me is how flavor intense, small amounts of sort of these residual sake products, how much they push beer around. We did a beer with Jester King where we added we had some koji, and Avery was in town, so it's let's just take the koji I have here, I'll make more, and we'll just add this to this beer that we're supposed to make. It's something we've always enjoyed doing with Jester King is having a plan and then just game dang it completely. Be well, this is what we have in hand, so what do you want to do? So it was not a ton of koji we added to that beer. It's called Signet. And I was just surprised at how much that flavor came through from less than 0.5% by volume or by weight or whatever.
Really?
Just a small amount. It's extremely flavor active, more than I was expecting. So it's been super fun just learning new stuff. Now that we've gotten the process of sake linked in a little bit, it allows us, and we have more volume than we had in the past, allows us to do some more experimentation with it. So we have a Galaxy dry hop sake and one with infused with pure yuzu oil, which is if you take an orange and like you express it, you get that oil that comes out. This is that, but from yuzu, so it's extremely expensive.
See, you're doing what American brewers do and turning up the volume on sake, huh?
Yeah. The dry hop one was just to make it a little bit more approachable and to see what effect it had. But that's the yuzu one. It's extremely. There's half a mil of yuzu oil in 20 liters, so it's almost nothing. But that stuff is so extremely potent, and it's just kind of fun.
It certainly is. It's it's a unique set of flavors that feel novel and different for my palate.
Yeah. And it's not anything we're gonna make a ton of money on, and it's not gonna be a volume product or a growth product for us. But it's just something we do to keep it interesting.
How's the beer audience that you have taken to these sake products?
Our audience, for the most part, is pretty adventurous. So people are very intrigued by it because not a lot of us know a lot about sake.
Sure.
So especially native fermented or mixed fermented sakes, which is not a lot of people in Japan know about that sort of stuff because that's not how, there are some sake producers over there that do that sort of stuff, but that's not how most sake is made.
Right.
So, it's just applying the same way of looking at beverages or alcohol or whatever the fuck.
Right.
Just as it's a different substrate than beer, but it's the same approach to it. So people seem to be intrigued.
Yeah.
We're releasing on Friday. The first time we released it, the bar was full. I imagine we'll be full tomorrow. So
yeah. Now, I find that trend interesting among brewers, especially those on the more creative bent, that have hung their hats on the more experimental front of beer. I was just talking to Jeffrey Stuffings of Jester King on Friday, and mentioned that they're changing their license from a brew pub license to a production brewery license because now they can sell beer over the tap or as a production brewery, but being a production brewery will allow them to make wine. And they are actively going to pursue a program of making their own wine using local Texas ingredients, and that was that's that next foray for them. And he described a similar thing that you said. They have time in their hands. They're curious about these things. They feel as if they've taken the beer where they want to take it, and they're continuing to experiment. But the risk in those experiments is more narrow now than it used to be, and so having achieved a certain comfort zone in that kind of sphere, they are actively looking for a way to push themselves out of that comfort zone again, and then moving into something like wine certainly puts them back at square one, trying to figure it out and figuring out how to apply their creative approach to that. It seems like you have a very similar kind of mindset here. We've done this on the beer side, and we're happy, but we're creative and restless people that need to now explore something and continue to push ourselves in order to do this. And so now you've found sake as that kind of avenue to continue pushing yourself.
Something like that, but less grandiose. Yeah.
As an editor, it's my job to make it sound more important than it might be.
Yeah.
So, are there any other plans in the works or other projects like that are kind of keeping you excited these days?
The other thing, we have some of it that's been the most fun project I've had in years. In addition to the sake stuff, has been this miscellanea project that we have. So we tend to work with other mixed ferm breweries. So over the years, a lot of our barrel stock is sort of,
right.
A very common thing is, they'll send their culture, we'll send our culture, and we mix the culture together and make something out of that. So over the years, like a lot of our barrel stock has a whole bunch of other people's stuff in it.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to, well, that was pretty loud. You don't want to throw those barrels away per se. But they're quintessentially different than stuff that we have that's just our own culture stuff. So one of our fooders here, we took all the barrel stock with all those different microbes from different breweries, different wild cultures, and blended them all together in one fooder. To try to do this.
A meta culture of sort.
Exactly. So different threads from the yeast from different breweries that we worked with over the years. And then we keep expanding on the stuff in that. So we're not trying to drain all the beer out, trying to get all the yeast out of it. We're just trying to continually expand that culture with other breweries. This has been a super fun project because the yeast is more or less the same, but yeast is slower changing. We're changing the base style. So we're drinking Miscellanea Volume 2 right now. The first one was a very sort of quintessential American Wild Ale, which is kind of a bullshit catch-all term anyway. But
Tell us how you really feel.
Kind of like an 8% beer with a little bit of Vienna and not a lot of hop character. Volume 2 wanted to switch up a little bit because we didn't change a lot of the yeast in it. We did add a little bit. We added one of our Hellbroth cultures and stuff from... We had something else, but I can't remember what it was. Oh, we added a laboratory strain of Brett C. That was the other thing we added to it. But we did a sort of super saison base, so a little bit lighter than the Miscellaneous Volume 1 was in terms of color and malt presence. So this stuff has stuff from Jester King, Side Project, Allagash's House Brett, and Central State, which is a fun little brewery out of Indianapolis. Good friends of ours. And then Volume 3, which is in there right now, we've added stuff from Jackie O's, and we'll maybe add something else to it as well. We only have one turn in there. Trying to get Ron Jeffries to come to Chicago, but that's a hard thing to do to get Ron out of Michigan right now.
When you start mixing these kinds of cultures from different breweries together, for one, obviously you're just looking to see what happens. There's almost a chaotic kind of joy element to it. Have you noticed how those things complement or compete with each other in that kind of broader context?
That's been the most fun part of this is, I know other people's cultures relatively well by working with those people and knowing their beers, know the JK stuff and how it works.
Right.
Spent a lot of time with the JK folks.
Sure.
So what's really fun is seeing how this sort of master blended culture shows all the different parts of what those things were. So like JK stuff has this sort of minerality. So certainly if you can pick this out in the beer, the Side stuff is much more acidic and has this very intense, almost like nectarine-like acid. I can see that in this beer, though it's a little bit more restrained because it's a part of the whole, not as much proportion. I definitely know what our stuff does. It's neat to see like all these different pieces and how that works together as a patchwork. So that's been the fun part for this for me. It's just I'm more surprised that you can see this more as a mosaic and still see like being able to hone in on the individual points. I thought it would actually be less than that, but.
And from the brewer perspective, you get that. From a consumer perspective, it's an interesting, with a high kind of citrus, tangerine, nectarine, maybe a little like hints of lime driving through it. Like it's a very fruity, kind of beer approach with a moderate acidity that's, it's pretty well controlled. It feels in line with that kind of citrus sweetness. I imagine it's not actually very sweet, and it simply just tastes.
This is zero Plato.
Yeah. It's that interesting trick that these kinds of beers play on you. They're perceived as much sweeter, even though they're not sweet beers. But from a consumer perspective, you could simply enjoy this broad, fruitiness and and there's that kind of layered character to it, without even having to pull out all of those individual pieces.
Yeah. I'm glad you think it tastes good.
Oh, it's delicious. Well, John Laffler, thanks for joining me on the podcast. I appreciate you sharing beers and sharing your perspective on brewing with us. If people want to learn more about Off Color, where do they find you?
Me? Well, I'm here at Mousetrap, but
yes.
They can find us on the website, which we still have.
Yeah, the website, that's so old school.
Yeah. They can send us a piece of mail. Please don't send me mail. I don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Usual social media channels are going to be the best. Again, we hired the best cat person who ran the best cat Twitter account to run our Twitter account. So
they can also send you cat memes then.
Oh, no, please send us cat pictures, please.
Yeah.
One of our things is we send Christmas cards to all the brewery cats that we know of every year.
Christmas cards to the brewery cats.
Yeah.
Well, if you're a cat fanatic, check out Off Color Brewing at all those places on the internet. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com, hit that subscribe button, and we will send you a magazine every 2 months as a result of that. So you can read about great brewers like John and Off Color Brewing and a whole bunch of others. Before we go, G&D Chillers sets the standard on quality, service, and reliability. Turn your fridge into the best beer bar around with Tavor. Ska Fabricating is the craft industry's leading choice for packaging line automation. And Clarion Lubricants is the expert that experts trust. We'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks, John, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.